called The Strange Death of Europe. And it was very timely, as indeed is tonight's subject. You might have seen on your way in, there are lots of publications and books that we do here at the New Culture Forum. And two of the things that we sort of majored in and done original research on are free speech and the increasing limits on free speech, and indeed media bias. Now, these are things that we've studied now over a period of 10 years. When you talk about media bias, of course, you're generally talking about the established media, by that which we mean the BBC, and increasingly, of course, Channel 4, Channel 5, and ITV, actually. The broadcasters
and Sky.
Obviously...
The Sky News.
Sky News, in fact, who are actually becoming worse than the others. I hope you've watched it lately. But these are very important topics, which brings me to tonight's discussion from our very, very distinguished speaker. And that is social media, the new battleground for free speech. When we first asked our guest if he would do this was some time ago. And in the intervening months, there seems to be a story about this very thing virtually on a daily basis. So our timing is very, very good here. Now, our speaker is a member of the European Parliament. He's also a former leader of UKIP. Those are his formal, if you like, titles to be found in Who's Who. However, I would say to you that probably you would agree that he is one of the most influential, if not the most influential politician actually that we've seen for 20, 25 years. And therefore it is a great pleasure that he is coming to talk to us about this particular subject, which is not the usual sort of subject for him to talk about. People think of him as Mr. Brexit. But to talk about social media, the new battleground for free speech, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Good evening, everybody. And I have to say, the New Culture Forum could not be a more appropriately named organisation to speak about this subject tonight, which is the new culture of social media. What it's done to the world of politics, much of which I think is really rather good, but the backlash that we're now seeing and what the implications of that are for free speech, democracy, and indeed our future in many, many ways. And of course, the Smith Lecture. And I know that Richard, of course, is a shrinking violet here in the audience. I shan't point him out. But he was done so much for so many causes of free speech, liberty, free markets. Yes, free markets, they still exist, honestly. Conservatism, again, an underground movement. And certainly in this country. So Richard, I'm very pleased to be here to give a speech named after you, with all that you've done. So thank you. It's very, very important that we have. Back in 2016, there began a political revolution. It has begun to sweep the Western world. And my contention is that none of it would have happened or could have happened without social media. You see, it was through social media that those of us who were considered outsiders, although I suppose I'm probably still considered by many as an outsider, although I take the term more to be a compliment than an insult. But it was by being able to bypass conventional media, get round the back of normal debate, that we were able actually to start putting out a very different message, one that people found to be liberating, and it led to very, very radical change. The trouble is that those people who'd created the very vehicles that we used to achieve this goal realised to their horror, all of them of course being West Coast liberals, that they, through their own creations, had helped these three remarkable big global political events. And of course I'm talking about Brexit, the election of the Donald, and the truly extraordinary, revolutionary things that have happened in Italian politics over the course of the last year. The reaction that we've had from those that own these social media sites now poses, in my view, a threat to the future of free speech, fair elections, indeed the entire democratic process. We have got to stop the bias, and actually, and this will surprise you from somebody who comes from the libertarian wing of politics, I mean, I hate big government, I generally distrust and loathe legislation, but I have to say, given where we are right now, my contention tonight is that something must be done. Now, my own case with this, very simple. I got elected as a UKIPper to the European Parliament way back in 1999, and I went to Brussels and I did my best over years to be, in the speeches I gave in the Parliament, generally as constructive and helpful and friendly as I possibly could be. Not so that anyone actually would have noticed. In fact, the truth of it was, even when the financial crisis hit 10 years ago, there is not a single thing, despite the fact that I was almost the only member of the European Parliament who even knew what a bond spread was or had traded a commodity. But the truth of it is, when that hit 10 years ago, there was nothing I said or did that would ever have even registered in mainstream media in this country. It was all too easy, too convenient to ignore what went on in the European Parliament, and least of all, what went on with this particular UKIP MEP. And then a remarkable thing happened. I started to talk about the divergence in bond spreads between Greece and Germany. I started to say that anybody with any basic understanding of how financial markets worked, of how risk worked, of how lending and borrowing worked, would understand that a major financial problem was coming down the road. And I was very lucky that an organisation in New York called Zero Hedge, who are now the biggest financial markets website in the world, but in those days were tiddlers. Zero Hedge would pick up my speeches in the European Parliament, package them, and within an hour of me speaking, traders sitting at their desks in the City of London, my brother included, would see what I'd said in the Strasbourg Parliament. Without Zero Hedge, I doubt I could have got anywhere. Because suddenly, speeches that would have been seen by virtually nobody were being seen by hundreds of thousands of people. And it started to happen virtually every single time I went to Strasbourg. And then in 2010, I got lucky. I was given a free gift. His name was Herman Van Rompuy. Now, of course, the other great... I think I've ruined his life, actually. So if you Google Herman Van Rompuy, despite the fact the man has been Prime Minister of Belgium, the man has been President of the European Council, if you Google Herman Van Rompuy, all you get is Nigel Farage and one particular speech. I mean, he'll never, ever forgive me. I could spend the whole evening talking about that speech, but I won't, although I'm certain that I enjoyed it more than he did. I was lucky in another sense, not just that he was this scruffy, scrawny, nondescript character who we were told would lead Europe onto the great global stage, but I was also lucky, well, although, you know, you make your own luck in life. As Gary Player said, the more I practice, the luckier I get. And I found myself in seat number 20 in the European Parliament, there in the front row. And of course, seat number 21, right next to me, is, of course, the European Commission President, which happens to be, these days, of course, Jean-Claude Juncker, who is an entertaining person to sit next to after a heavy night. But, of course, so there I was, absolutely in the centre of the well of the European Parliament, European Commission President next to me, and Herman Van Rompuy bang opposite me, no further away than those cameras are at the back of this room now. So in a sense, the stage was set. In a sense, I had the audience, I had the theatre, and I suppose perhaps I was lucky in that most politicians are very, very dull people who find it difficult to smile themselves, let alone make anybody else smile. But I did what I did with Herman Van Rompuy, or Rumpy Pumpy as he came to be known. And I gave my speech, and I said he had the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk, and all of which shows the risks of speaking without notes, because you never quite know what's going to come out. But that reached millions of people. Even the rap version of my speech got 6 million views. And that one speech, because of YouTube, completely transformed my standing with many, many millions of British voters in this country. They would never have seen that on the BBC 10 o'clock news. They would never have read it in one of Tim's columns in the Times. Very good to see you here. But the fact is, it would have got just about zero coverage in this country, as it was. As the millions started to watch it, suddenly what happened was conventional media bounced back onto it. Because of what was seen, suddenly ITV, the BBC, and yes, Sky News, just ignore the weather, it'll be okay. They started to cover it. The newspaper started to talk about it. And I would say, actually, that one speech on YouTube made me. It made me, because it made me a nationally known political figure. It actually made me better known than most people sitting in the cabinet today. I mean, how many people could pick out Philip Hammond in a lineup in Stoke-on-Trent? So social media, there's no doubt, played a huge, huge influence in getting to me where I got to, getting UKIP where it got to, and getting us actually to force Cameron to give us that referendum, which we fortunately managed to win. Not that our Prime Minister seems to understand that, but we'll move on to that later in questions. In America, Donald J. Trump. Trump the tweeter. Because that's what Trump does, isn't it? Trump just tweets. He completely bypasses.
Oh, hang on.
This is the rarest form of heckling I've ever encountered. Anywhere in the world. I did once have an F-35 jet takeoff next to me when I was giving a speech in East Anglia, but Peter, you've surpassed yourself this evening, I have to say.
I identify with Theresa May.
Yeah. Well, if it comes to blowing around in the wind, yes, then perhaps. Funny, isn't it, Theresa May, you know, the Chequers deal. Even the guys in Brussels were being beastly to her today. Isn't it funny? You know, Brussels is saying chuck Chequers, Boris is saying chuck Chequers, David Davis is saying chuck Chequers, the whole country is saying chuck Chequers, and yet she resolutely intends to stick with it. I think there's a disaster coming just around the corner. Let's get back to where we were after we were briefly interrupted by this gale that came in through the doors, no doubt part of the great warning that I'm going to give you this evening about what needs to be done. So the truth of it is that Trump went round the back of the liberal media and spoke directly to millions of people. He has been so phenomenally successful on Twitter that he now has over 50 million followers. So what does it matter that CNN gets watched by 400,000 people in the morning? What does it matter how many newspapers the New York Times sells when he is directly reaching 50 million people every day? And of course, he's reaching them before their alarm clocks have even gone off and they've got up to work. And all right, you know, I am a Trump supporter, and even for me occasionally, I look at these tweets and sort of think, has he really said that? But he has. He has, and it's him, isn't it? It's him, it's his gut instinct, it's who he is. Trump would never have been elected without Twitter. But the best example of all of how social media led to this incredible political revolution that started back with Brexit in 2016 and is now sweeping its way through the Western world, and I think has a lot further to go, to the horror of the liberal elites, is the example of Italy. You know, the best known stand-up comedian in the country, Beppe Grillo, who I know very well, teamed up with an internet genius called Gian Roberto Casaleggio. Casaleggio in very early on the dot-com boom, made a great deal of money out of it, and saw the potential for online platforms to revolutionize not just the way that people looked and thought about politics, but perhaps he thought the way in which political parties themselves could actually be managed and organized. So, between them, they set up the Five Star Movement, the first ever political party in the world run online. No stamps, no volunteers, no leaflets, just an online political platform. A platform on which party members choose the policies of the party. A platform on which the party members choose the candidates of the party. A website, a Facebook engagement that very quickly built up a following of millions. And from nowhere, this new political movement, who, by the way, refused to give interviews to the television or the radio or newspapers. They completely ignored conventional media. And they managed, earlier on this year, to win 32.3% of the vote in Italy and top the polls in the Italian elections. If ever there was an example of how social media had completely transformed the way we vote, the way we think, the way we organise, it was Casaleggio and Grillo that have done it. Although, to be fair, Matteo Salvini of the Lega is hardly a slouch, and he himself is engaging regularly with over 4 million Italians on Facebook and doing it several times every week. So, be in no doubt that social media was the means by which the global revolt, the populist revolution, call it whatever you want, use a complimentary term, use a pejorative term, it doesn't matter. But please, folks, recognise and hear from me, none of it could have happened ever without the use of social media. But it was the events of the 8th of November 2016 when Trump won, where the owners of those social media sites began to change their thinking and indeed their practices. You see, the thing is, we've been used in the past to giant media barons having huge power over who gets news, but I don't think we've ever seen, folks, anything quite like this. Just have a think for a moment how big and powerful and yet how few these companies are. Facebook has over 2 billion monthly users. Twitter is in relative terms a tiddler with just 330 million subscribers, but I think in many ways exerts an influence bigger than those numbers suggest. YouTube, I mean, just take this figure on board. YouTube has over 1 billion hours of video views every single day. You know, the number is so huge, it's difficult to even get into our heads. And the biggie, the real biggie, and the one that matters more than any of them, is of course Google. Google, which now has over 80% of the global market in internet searches. 3.5 billion internet searches every single day. It's just extraordinary. And Google is the most important of all of them because it is Google, in my opinion, that is the gateway. It is Google through which we now gather our information and ultimately form our political opinions. And for the under 40s, it's basically all that they have. I mean, I'm considered a dinosaur. You know, I come back on a Sunday morning with newspapers I can barely carry under my arm. I mean, none of my kids have ever bought a newspaper, and yet they're engaged and they care about current affairs. Even television viewership. Teenage kids don't watch television anymore. They watch everything on their devices. They get it through YouTube. They get it, you know, through whatever site their parents are prepared to pay for. We have fewer than a handful of companies who now control the entire future of our democratic debate across the entire Western world. And I think that now has very worrying implications indeed. On that extraordinary evening of the 8th of November 2016, when Trump stormed to victory, and I'll still never forget the faces of the CNN presenters. When Pennsylvania went Trump and they knew the game was up, as a Trump delegate in the room here who remembers it perhaps with even more passion than I did. But I think what happened in the immediate aftermath of that, and it's only just been revealed recently, which is actually a very good reason why I delayed this meeting, because I knew the news was coming, Peter, you see. The meeting that happened at the HQ out on the west coast of Google in the aftermath of that Trump victory was, I think, in many ways very deeply revealing. It was described as an all-hands meeting, so everybody from the top of the company to the lowest of the company were invited to come along and join in this conversation. And one of the co-founders of Google, Sergey Brin, said on that day that he was deeply offended by the election of Trump and that the election result conflicts with many of Google's values. He went on to talk about the rise of extremism. One of the vice presidents, Kent Walker, at this meeting said, "We must work to ensure that populism and nationalism is no more than a blip." The chief executive officer, Sundar Pichai, said, we will develop educational tools to reach low information voters. I mean, these are clear statements, not just of short-term upset that the blessed Hillary had not won the election and that this foul-mouthed lorry driver, as they saw him, had won the election. These were very clear statements of intent that Google would change its modus operandi to deal, as they saw it, with this problem. And of course, you know, hand in glove with all of this, their own internal think tank, had a whole series of tools intended to redirect those that were using Google away from content that they deemed to be extremist. Now look, this all depends on definitions. It all depends on what you think populism is as opposed to what you think extremism is. And I accept, of course I accept, that all of these things are subjectives. But I would argue that on that day, the day after Trump got elected, the biggest internet search engine, the most powerful, important tech company in the world, in terms of how we gain our information and form our opinions, effectively declared war on the whole populist revolt that was happening across the West. There was only one happy thing that happened that day, and that was the Chief Financial Officer, Ruth Porat, in her speech, broke down in tears and suggested delegates hugged the person next to them as a means of dealing with this deep trauma. And so it all began. It all began the shadow banning on Twitter, the algorithm changes that took place on Facebook, which saw, within a few months, very modest increases for those of a liberal, and by the way, I'm talking in this context generally of an American perspective, and I think it's important that we do discuss this primarily in an American context. It's in America where these vehicles were created. It's in America where they've reached such a huge scale, and whatever happens in America in terms of this technology happens in this country a year or two down the line. So we saw small increases within a few months of these algorithm changes in the numbers that liberal publishers were getting, but we saw the most extraordinary decline in the footage and coverage that was being got by conservative voices. Indeed, within the first few months of these changes, Donald Trump's own Facebook engagement declined by 45%. Now, of course, it's quite possible that Trump had become so dull and so boring and so uninteresting that nobody was particularly interested. But I put it to you that as president, virtually every day has been a crackerjack, and there's been plenty to look at and talk about and think about. But 45% in the first few months, Trump's own Facebook engagement was down. Facebook themselves said that they changed their policy and they increasingly were promoted what they viewed to be broadly trusted sources. So you see, you've got these giant companies now effectively saying they are policing their own content. They are using their own levels of subjectivity as to what they think is reliable, what they think is, dare one say it, fake news, and what they think may be inclined towards extremist content. Now, it's important to bear in mind that the internet has been used by some extremely bad people. Very important to recognize that people like ISIS, and there's no question, extreme racist groups, violent groups, who have used the internet to propagate their agendas of hate and violence. And of course we want, don't we? We actually want the internet providers to try to close down as much as they can on these things. We've even heard today from the British government that they are perhaps going to put something in place in the course of the next year or so to try and make sure that websites and others that post extremist material or violent material, if that material is not removed within a short space of time, then the government will come down heavily on them with fines or bans or whatever it may be. But folks, if the attempt to stop the internet being used to propagate violence, terrorism and extremism extends because of the bias of those who run those companies and work within those companies to closing down debate on sensible, democratic, conservative values, then we have a very, very major problem. And we've seen shadow banning, I mentioned it earlier, the means by which many people out there with big internet followings, big Twitter followings, suddenly find their posts aren't reaching their people. The same thing happens on Facebook. In my own case, and whilst I may not be personally the most technologically savvy person in the world, I recognized early on that this was the new means of communication. The only British political figure who's got higher numbers than me across Facebook and Twitter is Jeremy Corbyn. I'm second to Jeremy Corbyn. I'm double roughly what Boris is, which is remarkable. I shouldn't be, but I am. But in terms of engagement, there are many weeks of the month when I would beat Corbyn. So I probably have, on average, more internet contact with the British public than any other British commentator or political thinker or actor. And yet, even I've found, over the course of the last year, much, much harder for my stuff to reach the kind of audiences that it was back in 2016. So there's nothing imagined about this. It is happening. And yet the bizarre thing is, we've even gone now to the stage where nobody on the other side can even deny this is happening, because we now have a total ban on Alex Jones from InfoWars. Now, you can say what you like about Alex Jones. You can say that his questioning of the validity of what happened at Sandy Hook was wrong, irresponsible. But hey, folks, Alex Jones is somebody with a strong view. Alex Jones is somebody with a strong following. I'm not standing here defending Alex Jones. And this is what happens, isn't it? This is what happens with our media. If you stand up and try and stand for principle, you're accused of being an Alex Jones supporter. I'm not making that argument, but I am making the argument that if you want to ban Alex Jones and InfoWars, media sites that have got many millions of subscribers all over the world, you are not that far away from taking books out of libraries and burning them in public squares. That is how important this whole issue of free speech really is. And yet it seems the same standards don't apply to those on the other side. We can go to the delightful Sarah Young, who works at the New York Times, who puts out on Twitter, "Oh man, it's kind of sick how much I enjoy being cruel to old white people." But that's okay. That's absolutely fine. No action gets taken at all. Or try this. "I'm sorry it's a bit sick, but I'm going to use it." Peter Fonda, actor of The Famous Family, after the argument over what was happening with children and parents being separated coming in across the Mexican border, and Peter Fonda puts out on Twitter, he says, "Rip Baron Trump from his mother and put him in a cage with paedophiles." Now, I don't know about you. That to me is pretty sick. That to me is about as low as it can get. And yet we don't find Peter Fonda being suspended. We don't find Peter Fonda being warned. We are finding the application of double standards going on across these platforms where our under 40s spend basically most of their lives. Even PragerU, again, and I'm sorry folks, this is so America-centric, but it has to be, because that is where this stuff started. That's where this stuff is big. Prager University, PragerU, I've appeared in their videos. Very, very reputable, conservative organization. And yes, they're pro-family. I mean, they're very strongly pro-family. They've got 3 million Facebook followers. They've got 1.6 million YouTube subscribers. I have not seen a single thing put out on PragerU that I could describe as being extremist content in any way at all. And yet, very cleverly, there is now hugely restricted access to every single one of their last 8 videos. Now, they're a powerful organization. There is a big court case going on right now. Folks, the point is, there is now an absolute mountain of evidence. It is unarguable that since November 2016, there's been a huge shift. There is now a massive bias that has now become actually endemic on social media. Okay, it's mostly America, but we've seen people banned here too, haven't we? I'm not a Tommy Robinson fan. I am not a Tommy Robinson fan. I think he's a bit of a lout, but I do think he should be allowed to have his say. I do think in a society that believes in free speech, provided he is not promoting outright hatred or violence, he should be able to say what he wants to say. So, does something need to be done? Well, I think this is too important for something not to be done. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, or Zuck, as he's known to his friends, which doesn't include me. I met him recently at the European Parliament. He came for a hearing at the European Parliament, and he kept repeating this Facebook mantra, that Facebook is a platform for all ideas. I confronted him. I pointed out the arithmetical downturns in Trump on Facebook and many other conservative commentators. I said to him, you cannot be a platform for all ideas if you discriminate in favor of some ideas against other ideas. I said, Mr. Zuckerberg, you have now become a publisher. And as a publisher, you are responsible for the content that is put out in your name. And I feel very, very strongly about that. They should be, given their behavior, reclassified as a publisher and held to account. And I'm pleased to say that very shortly after that, I received a considerable degree of support from a guy called Brad Pascal. Now, he may not be known to many of you, but he was Trump's social media man during the election campaign. Folks, it wasn't Cambridge Analytica. If you're here from The Guardian, you've wasted your trip. I'm really, really sorry. It wasn't Cambridge Analytica, it was Brad Pascal, who was the digital social media man for Trump. And Pascal wrote a week after I'd had this confrontation with the Zuck. He said, if Twitter is acting like a normal publisher, it should be treated like one. Because you see, Twitter claim to have true diversity of political discourse, and yet, unarguably, they are shadow banning and banning people. So I do think the reclassification of many of these people as publishers is very important. That would involve, in American legal terms, an amendment to Article 230 of their own Communications Act, and perhaps something appropriate in this country and the rest of Europe too. And I'm naturally one of these people of a conservative persuasion and perhaps more of a libertarian persuasion. I am rarely one of those people who says there's a problem. Something must be done. We must have legislation. We must ban dogs. We must ban handguns. We must, and I'm generally appalled by all of this stuff. But I do think the issues at stake here are so fundamental and so important. We cannot allow the whole future political discourse affecting the young people across the entire Western world to be held in the hands of 2 or 3 people who, through their own mouths and utterances, have shown themselves not to be politically neutral. So I think the big one that will come will be the concept of a Bill of Rights for social media users, backed up by a proper regulator. And I am the first to accept that all of this is imperfect. I'm the first to accept that all of this will rely, to a large degree, on subjective judgments. But I don't think we can allow the Jack Dorseys and the Mark Zuckerbergs to make their own subjective judgments on their organisations that they run for vast commercial profit. I think there is an argument for ombudsmen, there is an argument for regulators. We could even go further, I suppose, and argue that under antitrust laws, some of these big firms should be broken up. And it's ironic that it's the European Union, that I'm not particularly a lover of, that has been consistently fining Google and others for acting unfairly in the marketplace. I guess even Mr. Juncker doesn't get absolutely everything wrong. I think we need legislation. I think we need change. I believe that Donald Trump, with his campaign manager Brad Pascal, will go into those 2020 presidential elections promising a Bill of Rights for social media, doing their best to redress this balance, doing their best to end the bias. And we've got to end the bias. And I never thought I'd ever stand on a political platform anywhere in the world arguing for a regulator, arguing for legislation. We could do it in this country if we chose to, but to do it in isolation simply isn't going to work. This has to start in America. And I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you agree with me. Whether or not in this room you share the same political opinions as me isn't really the point. This is the means by which the future generations will gain their information, will form their opinions. We have to do our absolute utmost to make sure this is done in as fairer, unbiased way as it possibly can be. The whole future of trust, faith and belief in our democratic processes relies upon it. Thank you.